What happened to the side dishes from the 1970s no one makes anymore? These side dishes once filled potluck tables and family dinners, adding color, comfort, and personality to every gathering. If they meant so much then, why did we let them vanish? Mushroom rice pilaf was one of those dishes that showed just how much the 1970s leaned into casseroles as the answer for everything. Housewives would reach for canned mushrooms, pour them into rice, and simmer the whole thing with bouillon cubes until the flavor seeped through. Some would stop there and serve it straight from the stove, but the more popular approach was to pour it into a casserole dish and bake it until the top formed a crust. It was one of those meals that felt just fancy enough for a potluck without costing much or demanding complicated work. The canned mushrooms gave it that earthy taste, and when you added in the richness of broth, it seemed like something better than just plain rice. For families, it was filling and easy to reheat, which is why it showed up on dinner tables again and again. Mushroom rice pilaf sat quietly next to roasts or chicken, and sometimes it even became the star on its own. Today, it has mostly faded from memory, but back then it was a dependable comfort that everyone knew how to make. Celery crown salad was as much a visual piece as it was a food because the presentation mattered almost more than the taste. Housewives would take celery stalks, chill them until crisp, then fan them into the shape of a crown on a serving platter. The stalks would be held together with toothpicks or bands and then dressed with mayonnaise or a cheese-based sauce to add flavor. Sometimes pimentos or olives were added for color, turning the plain green into something more dramatic. It was refreshing, crunchy, and light, which made it a common sight on buffet tables crowded with heavier casseroles. The 1970s were a time when appearance at the table held value, and celery crown salad looked like something made with care even if it was simple to assemble. It offered a cool bite that balanced the richness of other dishes, and children often picked at it because of its playful shape. Though rarely made today, it once brought a sense of occasion to everyday celery. Tomato aspic with shrimp garnish might be the ultimate example of how far gelatin molds could be pushed during the 1970s. Housewives would take tomato juice, mix it with unflavored gelatin, and let it set in ornate molds until it became a firm, jiggling centerpiece. On top of that shimmering red dome, cold shrimp would be arranged in neat patterns, often crowned with parsley for decoration. The dish was tangy, savory, and oddly refreshing, though the texture caught some people off guard. It was served cold as a side or appetizer, sometimes sliced into wedges like a cake. For potlucks and luncheons, tomato aspic stood out on the table because it looked unusual and sophisticated. It was the kind of dish that showed effort and creativity, even if guests approached it with caution. In an era that loved experimentation with molds, this savory gelatin became a conversation starter as much as a food. Though long gone from modern tables, it represents the quirky inventiveness of 1970s kitchens. Golden glow salad was another brightly colored creation that turned up at nearly every church gathering or family potluck. It was made with orange-flavored gelatin mixed with grated carrots and crushed pineapple, a combination that blended sweetness with a touch of vegetable crunch. Housewives would prepare it in large molds or pans and slice it into cubes or wedges, sometimes topping it with whipped cream or a creamy dressing. The bright orange color made it visually striking, earning its name as it seemed to glow under the lights of buffet tables. It was sweet enough that children loved it, but the carrots gave it the illusion of being healthy. Families considered it a salad even though it leaned more toward dessert, because gelatin salads were a category all their own in that decade. Golden glow salad showed how creative cooks could get with inexpensive pantry items, turning 3 simple ingredients into a memorable side dish. Though it rarely appears today, its place in 1970s potluck culture was nearly guaranteed. Cheese souffle casserole was a simplified take on the classic French souffle, adapted for the practicality of American households. Instead of fussing with delicate timing and perfect rises, housewives would prepare a cheesy egg mixture and bake it in a casserole dish until puffy and golden. It offered the look and taste of a souffle without the stress of collapse, making it ideal for potlucks and family dinners. The dish carried a rich, savory flavor that paired well with salads, meats, or even just bread. It was hearty enough to act as a main dish, but usually played the role of a side, standing proudly among other casseroles of the era. For families who wanted to bring something impressive to gatherings, cheese souffle casserole delivered both taste and reliability. Children liked its creamy texture, while adults appreciated the sense of European flair without complicated cooking. Though the souffle name gave it elegance, the casserole format made it accessible to everyone. Today it is almost forgotten, but in the 1970s it was a proud showcase of ingenuity. Lima bean supreme was a side dish that took a humble legume and dressed it up for special occasions. Lima beans were simmered until tender, then folded into a creamy sauce often flavored with butter, milk, and a touch of nutmeg. The mixture was poured into a baking dish, topped with breadcrumbs, and baked until golden and bubbling. It transformed the often overlooked lima bean into something rich and comforting, with a texture that appealed even to those who usually avoided them. Housewives appreciated it because it was economical, yet felt dressed up enough to bring to potlucks or serve at Sunday dinners. Children were coaxed into eating their vegetables when lima bean supreme appeared because the creamy sauce softened the flavors and made it more approachable. It was one of those recipes that fit perfectly into the casserole culture of the 1970s, blending thrift with a little indulgence. Today it is hard to find, but it once stood as proof that even the plainest vegetables could be made into something memorable. Prune whip mold was a dessert-like side dish that found its way onto many 1970s tables. Prunes were stewed until soft, whipped into a light puree, and folded with gelatin and whipped cream. The mixture was poured into molds and chilled until it set, creating a delicate, airy texture. The flavor was sweet yet mild, offering a way to enjoy fruit in a new and interesting form. It was often served in slices or scoops, sometimes topped with extra cream or nuts. Housewives relied on prune whip mold because it was easy to prepare, inexpensive, and could be made ahead of time for gatherings. It appealed especially to adults who appreciated its subtle sweetness and lightness after heavy main dishes. Prune whip mold carried the same charm as other gelatin-based recipes of the era, with the bonus of feeling wholesome thanks to the fruit base. Though it has nearly disappeared from menus today, it once held a firm place as a creative, thrifty, and surprisingly elegant dish for families and guests alike. Cauliflower au gratin was a side dish that brought comfort and richness to 1970s dinner tables. Cauliflower florets were steamed until tender, then smothered in a cream sauce heavy with cheese and baked beneath a topping of breadcrumbs. The result was a bubbling golden dish that gave the plain vegetable an entirely new identity. Families enjoyed it as a complement to roasts, chicken, or even pork chops because it added both substance and flavor. Housewives liked it because it could be assembled ahead and baked when needed, making it ideal for busy schedules. It was creamy, hearty, and indulgent, fitting perfectly into the casserole craze of the time. Children who might have resisted cauliflower on its own often enjoyed it baked under the cheese and crumb topping. Cauliflower au gratin proved that vegetables did not have to be boring, and that with enough butter and cheese they could become centerpieces of meals. Though it feels old-fashioned today, it once represented the height of comfort cooking in the 1970s. Cold beet borscht cups brought an unusual European influence into American kitchens of the 1970s. Beets were boiled, chilled, and pureed into a cold soup flavored with vinegar, dill, and sometimes sour cream. Instead of serving it in bowls, housewives poured it into small cups, offering it as a quirky side or appetizer. The vibrant magenta color made it striking, and its refreshing taste stood out at summer gatherings. While not everyone embraced its earthy flavor, those who did found it invigorating, especially when paired with bread or crackers. Cold beet borscht cups reflected the era's willingness to experiment with international dishes, even if they seemed unusual on American tables. They were considered refined in some circles, a nod to cosmopolitan tastes during a decade of culinary curiosity. For families, they offered variety and a sense of something different from the usual casseroles and gelatin salads. Today they seem nearly forgotten, but they once represented the adventurous spirit of 1970s kitchens. Avocado pineapple salad was one of those curious combinations that only the 1970s could have produced. Avocado halves were scooped and filled with pineapple chunks, then topped with a dollop of mayonnaise or sometimes cottage cheese. The result was a creamy, tangy, and slightly sweet side dish that looked exotic at potlucks and luncheons. Housewives appreciated it because avocados were gaining popularity and pineapple, whether canned or fresh, was inexpensive and readily available. The pairing of fruit with creamy dressings was a trend that defined the decade, and avocado pineapple salad fit neatly into that mold. Guests were often intrigued by the unusual combination, and while some loved it, others hesitated at the blend of flavors. Still, it represented the playful experimentation of the time, when food was as much about presentation and novelty as it was about taste. Avocado pineapple salad, though nearly lost today, stands as a snapshot of a decade that thrived on curiosity and creativity at the table. Spanish rice with green peppers was one of those side dishes that showed up on dinner tables and potluck spreads all across the 1970s. Housewives would take plain rice, stir it into tomato sauce, then add onions and chopped bell peppers before baking it in the oven. The result was a colorful casserole that brought together sweetness, tang, and a little bite from the peppers. It was inexpensive and hearty, which made it perfect for families looking to stretch meals without serving the same old plain rice every night. Spanish rice was often paired with chicken or pork chops, but it could also stand on its own next to beans or salad. Some cooks even added a sprinkle of cheese on top, letting it melt into a gooey crust. The dish carried a sense of flair because it looked fancier than it really was, and the peppers gave it a bright edge that guests remembered. Today, it feels like a relic, but in the 1970s, Spanish rice with green peppers was a dependable favorite that balanced thrift with flavor. Cabbage slaw with sunflower seeds was a crunchy twist on the classic coleslaw, giving it a slightly nutty bite that made it memorable. Shredded cabbage was tossed with carrots and sometimes raisins, then mixed with mayonnaise or vinegar dressing. Sunflower seeds were sprinkled in, adding both texture and a surprising depth of flavor. This variation became popular because it felt fresh and wholesome, fitting the health-focused trends creeping into the 1970s. It was also affordable, since cabbage was inexpensive and sunflower seeds were widely available in bulk. Families loved it because it paired well with grilled meats, baked chicken, or sandwiches, and it held up well at picnics. It was light but filling, crunchy but creamy, and versatile enough for all kinds of gatherings. Children often picked at the seeds while parents appreciated the nutritional value. Though it has almost vanished from modern tables, cabbage slaw with sunflower seeds once stood proudly as a reflection of the era's push toward foods that felt both homemade and just a little different. Frosted lime salad was a vivid green spectacle that lived on buffet tables and Sunday dinners throughout the decade. It began with lime-flavored gelatin, which was poured into molds and chilled until firm. On top of that shimmering green base, housewives would spread a frosting made of cream cheese blended with crushed pineapple. The result was a layered dish that was part dessert, part salad, and entirely a conversation starter. Guests marveled at its bold color and unusual combination of tangy, sweet, and creamy flavors. Children enjoyed the pineapple while adults admired the cool, refreshing texture. It was one of those recipes that fit perfectly into the gelatin craze of the 1970s, where even salads were expected to jiggle. Frosted lime salad carried an almost retro elegance, presented in rings, domes, or squares depending on the mold used. Though its popularity faded, it still embodies the playful experimentation of an era that valued novelty as much as taste. In its own quirky way, frosted lime salad reflected the 1970s at its brightest and boldest. Mock crab salad was the thrifty answer for families who wanted the sophistication of seafood without paying seafood prices. The recipe appeared often in budget cookbooks, calling for shredded vegetables like cabbage or zucchini mixed with mayonnaise and seasoning to mimic the look and texture of crab. A splash of vinegar or lemon juice added tang, while paprika or celery seed provided color and flavor. Served chilled, It was spooned onto lettuce leaves or stuffed into tomatoes, making it look fancier than it really was. Housewives loved it because it gave the illusion of serving something indulgent while costing only pennies. It worked well as a potluck dish since it could be prepared in large batches and kept cool until serving time. For families, it was a playful way to bring variety to the table when fish was out of reach. Though it has mostly disappeared today, mock crab salad captures the spirit of resourceful 1970s cooking, where appearance and ingenuity counted for just as much as actual ingredients. Apricot rice salad blended sweet and savory flavors in a way that reflected the experimental side of 1970s kitchens. Cooked rice was chilled and then mixed with apricot preserves, chopped nuts, and sometimes a splash of lemon juice. The mixture was scooped into bowls or molded into rings, often garnished with lettuce for presentation. It was both filling and refreshing, combining the substance of rice with the sweetness of fruit. Housewives liked it because it could be made ahead and served cold, perfect for summer gatherings. The addition of nuts added texture and richness, while the apricot gave it a golden glow that stood out on crowded tables. Children found it fun because it felt like a dessert, while adults appreciated the unusual flavor balance. Apricot rice salad was a reflection of the decade's willingness to blur the lines between savory and sweet, salad and dessert. It is rarely seen today, but it once carried pride as a quirky, eye-catching dish that was affordable and memorable. Celery with pimento cheese was a simple but striking buffet favorite that added a pop of color to spreads filled with casseroles and meats. Celery stalks were trimmed, chilled until crisp, and then stuffed with a bright orange pimento cheese spread. The combination of creamy, sharp cheese with crunchy celery made for a satisfying bite. It was inexpensive, easy to prepare, and visually appealing, which is why it appeared at so many parties, picnics, and luncheons. The pimento spread itself was made with cheddar, mayonnaise, and diced pimentos, giving it a tangy and slightly sweet edge. Children enjoyed the crunch, while adults praised its nostalgic flavor. It was often arranged on trays in neat rows, making it look both tidy and inviting. Celery with pimento cheese was the kind of dish that carried Southern influence into mainstream gatherings during the 1970s. Though overlooked now, it once stood as a dependable, cheerful option that could be counted on to disappear quickly from the table. Eggplant au vin reflected the growing trend of borrowing from European flavors to make vegetables more exciting. Sliced eggplant was layered in a baking dish, drenched with red wine sauce and baked until soft and savory. It was a side dish that carried richness and a touch of sophistication, offering something different from the heavy casseroles that dominated the era. Housewives liked it because it transformed a plain vegetable into something impressive without requiring expensive meat or cheese. The red wine gave it a bold flavor that set it apart, making it a conversation piece at dinner parties. Eggplant au vin was often paired with roasted chicken or beef, but it was strong enough to hold its own as a main for lighter meals. Though eggplant was not always a favorite among children, the sauce made it more approachable for adults. It represents the 1970s curiosity with international flair, a time when American cooks wanted to feel worldly without straying too far from comfort. Eggplant au vin is rarely seen today, but it once carried quiet elegance into everyday kitchens. French dressing mold was one of the more daring uses of gelatin during the decade, turning salad dressing into a solid side dish. Housewives would combine French dressing with unflavored gelatin, then fold in vegetables like celery, olives, or green peppers before letting it set in ornate molds. The result was a wobbly, tangy creation that looked almost too strange to eat, but always sparked conversation. Served sliced, it offered bright color and unusual texture alongside heavier mains. Some versions included hard-boiled eggs for extra substance. French dressing mold reflected the obsession with molds that swept through kitchens at the time, where anything could be transformed into a shimmering side. It was thrifty, it was experimental, and it carried the charm of novelty. Though it is hard to imagine today, guests once accepted it as part of the playful spread. French dressing mold may not have aged well, but it remains a clear reminder of the fearless culinary creativity of the 1970s. Puffed wheat casserole was an inventive way to take a breakfast cereal and turn it into a savory side dish. Housewives would mix puffed wheat with a cheesy sauce, spread it in a baking dish, and bake until bubbly and golden. The cereal acted like breadcrumbs, giving the dish a toasty crunch on top while softening inside. It was unusual but surprisingly comforting, and it showed the willingness of 1970s kitchens to stretch pantry staples in new directions. Puffed wheat casserole paired well with meats or stood on its own for light meals. Children liked it because of the cereal connection, while adults appreciated its frugality and flavor. It was easy to prepare in large pans, making it a natural fit for potlucks. Though it has mostly disappeared, it embodies the spirit of reimagining everyday ingredients. Puffed wheat casserole may sound strange now, but in the 1970s it carried warmth, thrift, and a dash of creativity that made it memorable. Pickled watermelon rind was one of the most surprising side dishes of the decade, turning what many would throw away into something flavorful and refreshing. Housewives peeled the green outer skin, sliced the white rind, and simmered it in a brine of vinegar, sugar, and spices until it became tender and tangy. The result was a sweet-sour pickle that was served in relish trays or alongside meats. It was a way of practicing thrift while also creating a unique taste that stood out at gatherings. Families valued it because it stretched food further and prevented waste, while guests admired its novelty. Pickled watermelon rind reflected the ingenuity of making use of every part of seasonal produce. It brought brightness to heavy meals and was a talking point at tables where everyone expected the usual pickles. Though it has nearly disappeared today, it once stood proudly as a reminder of how resourcefulness and creativity could turn scraps into something memorable. Shredded wheat tomato bake was one of those unusual dishes that turned a breakfast staple into something savory for dinner tables. Housewives would layer shredded wheat biscuits in a casserole dish, pour stewed tomatoes over them, and top it with grated cheese. When baked, the biscuits softened into a dense base that absorbed all the tomato flavor, while the cheese formed a golden crust. It was thrifty, creative, and surprisingly filling, making it a dependable addition for meatless nights. Children often raised eyebrows at the sight, but many families relied on it to stretch limited groceries. It carried a home-style charm and was easy to put together using pantry items that were already on hand. Though it may sound odd today, shredded wheat tomato bake reflected the 1970s trend of experimentation in casseroles. It was practical, it was comforting, and it showed how resourceful cooks were in making the most of what they had. While forgotten now, it once carried a quiet sense of pride to buffet spreads. Curried eggplant cubes reflected the decade's curiosity with global flavors, even if they were adapted into very simple home versions. Eggplant was chopped into cubes, sautéed in oil, and tossed with curry powder until the pieces turned golden and fragrant. It was usually served warm alongside chicken or lamb, adding an exotic note to otherwise traditional meals. Housewives liked it because it made use of an inexpensive vegetable while giving the impression of sophistication. For adventurous families, it felt like a small culinary trip without leaving the dining room. The mild curry flavor was tempered with onions or garlic, ensuring it was not too strong for children. It was an approachable way to introduce spice into a table that often leaned on casseroles and creamed vegetables. Curried eggplant cubes might seem dated now, but back then they symbolized the changing tastes of America, where international seasonings were starting to trickle into kitchens. It was humble but exciting, and it gave weeknight dinners a spark of variety. Carrot ring mold was part of the gelatin craze that dominated many potluck tables in the 1970s. Mashed carrots were blended with gelatin and chilled into a ring mold, creating a firm yet colorful dish. The center of the ring was often filled with peas or green beans, turning it into both a vegetable and a centerpiece. It was sweetened lightly to balance the carrot's natural earthiness, making it more appealing to guests. Housewives served it at luncheons and buffets where presentation mattered just as much as taste. The ring shape gave it a sense of occasion, while the vegetables inside provided texture and contrast. Though unusual by today's standards, it was considered a clever way to encourage families to eat their vegetables. Carrot ring mold carried the signature look of the decade. colorful, playful, and just a little experimental. It was part salad, part side dish, and part decoration, proving how creative home cooks were willing to be. Cottage cheese ring with vegetables was another molded side dish that highlighted how much the 1970s embraced shapes and presentation. Cottage cheese was whipped with gelatin until it could hold its form, then set into a ring mold and chilled. The hollow center was filled with cold vegetables like peppers, celery, or cucumbers. The dish was creamy, tangy, and refreshing, making it a curious addition to potlucks and luncheons. Guests were often impressed by its tidy presentation, and the mixture of textures made it interesting to eat. It was one of those recipes that stretched inexpensive cottage cheese into something bigger and more impressive. Housewives valued it because it could be made ahead and kept chilled until serving time, freeing up energy for other preparations. It was thrifty but visually striking, capturing the era's fascination with molds. While it may not appeal to modern tastes, cottage cheese ring with vegetables once stood as a proud centerpiece of 1970s gatherings. Cold noodle salad with sesame seeds reflected the gradual influence of Asian flavors entering American kitchens in the 1970s. Thin noodles were boiled, chilled, and tossed with sesame seeds, soy sauce, and sometimes sliced scallions. The dish was served cold, offering a refreshing break from heavier casseroles. It was easy to prepare in large batches, making it perfect for potlucks and picnics. For many families, it was their first taste of international cuisine adapted to suit local preferences. Sesame seeds added nuttiness and crunch, while the soy sauce provided a salty depth that was new to many palates. Housewives appreciated its novelty and lightness, especially during the warmer months. Children enjoyed the simple flavors, while adults praised its uniqueness. Cold noodle salad with sesame seeds was a modest step toward culinary diversity, proving that even small changes in ingredients could reshape tables. It may not have survived into modern popularity, but it marked a moment when tastes began to expand in earnest. Cucumber Bavarian cream was one of the most unusual molded salads of the 1970s. Cucumbers were pureed, blended with gelatin, and folded into cream before being poured into molds and chilled. The result was a pale green dish with a smooth texture and cool, refreshing flavor. It was often served in slices as part of buffet spreads, adding a quirky yet elegant note to the table. Guests were intrigued by its appearance, even if the flavor surprised them. Housewives liked it because it took a simple, inexpensive vegetable and transformed it into something striking. It was also considered refined, borrowing from European influences that were fashionable at the time. While the texture confused some diners, others found it light and refreshing. Cucumber Bavarian cream may sound peculiar now, but it showcased the 1970s willingness to experiment with ingredients and forms. It was playful, creative, and a reminder that even the humblest vegetable could become something entirely unexpected. Oyster plant hash was a novelty side dish that made use of salsify, a root vegetable sometimes called oyster plant for its faint seafood-like flavor. The roots were peeled, chopped, and fried in a skillet like hash browns, giving them a crispy exterior and tender interior. It was inexpensive, unusual, and a way to bring variety to the dinner table. Housewives liked it because it added interest to familiar meals, while guests found its name intriguing enough to try. The subtle flavor paired well with eggs, meats, or even just bread, making it flexible as a side dish. Oyster plant hash represented the experimental spirit of the 1970s, when home cooks were willing to try lesser-known ingredients. Though it never became mainstream, it stood as proof of culinary curiosity during the decade. Families that embraced it remembered it as a quirky but satisfying dish that helped meals feel different without being costly. Sunshine carrot salad was one of the brightest and cheeriest dishes on 1970s buffet tables. Grated carrots were mixed with raisins and crushed pineapple, then bound together with mayonnaise. The result was colorful, sweet, and tangy, offering a refreshing balance to heavier foods. It was a favorite at picnics and church suppers because it was inexpensive and easy to make in large quantities. Housewives liked it because it looked vibrant and wholesome, while children enjoyed the sweet fruit mixed in with the vegetables. It carried the cheerful name of Sunshine Carrot Salad because of its bright orange hue and fruity flavor. The mayonnaise added creaminess that turned it into more of a salad than a dessert, though it walked the line between the two. Sunshine Carrot Salad may not have survived modern tastes, but in the 1970s it represented the desire to make everyday vegetables more appealing. It was simple, colorful, and dependable, which made it a lasting memory for many families. Radish and orange salad was a curious pairing that reflected the playful experimentation of the decade. Thinly sliced radishes were layered with orange segments, creating a colorful combination of sharp spice and sweet citrus. A light dressing of vinegar or honey was sometimes drizzled on top, balancing the flavors. It was crisp, refreshing, and visually striking, making it a standout at luncheons or dinners. Housewives served it because it was inexpensive and unusual, giving them a dish that guests would not forget. The salad offered contrast to the creamy casseroles and gelatin molds that filled most tables. Children might have resisted the peppery bite of radishes, but adults often appreciated the sophistication of the pairing. Radish and orange salad carried a sense of lightness that made it especially welcome during the warmer months. Though it vanished quickly from popularity, it once stood as a bold reflection of the 1970s willingness to push flavor boundaries. Green pea loaf was another example of the decade's fascination with turning vegetables into loaf form. Pureed peas were mixed with eggs, breadcrumbs, and seasoning, then baked into a firm loaf that could be sliced and served cold or warm. It was thrifty and filling, providing substance without relying on expensive meats. Housewives valued it as a creative way to serve vegetables in a form that felt substantial. For luncheons, it was sliced neatly and arranged on platters, sometimes topped with cream sauce or garnished with herbs. The texture was dense yet tender, making it satisfying enough to stand on its own. Children often needed coaxing to try it, but adults appreciated its heartiness. Green pea loaf was a reflection of the 1970s casserole culture, where almost anything could be transformed into a loaf or mold. Though forgotten today, it carried a sense of resourcefulness and pride, showing how cooks could make vegetables into something impressive. Cornmeal mush was a dish born out of need, but remembered for its quiet comfort. Grandma would cook cornmeal slowly with water or milk until it thickened into a soft porridge, then pour it into a pan to chill overnight. By morning, it would be firm enough to slice, and she would fry it in a hot skillet until the edges turned crisp and golden. It was eaten with butter, syrup, or even a fried egg on top, whatever the pantry allowed. This was not flashy food, it was sustenance, plain and simple. But it filled bellies, warmed cold mornings, and never cost more than a few cents to make. Some people grew up thinking of it as Southern fare, others knew it as polenta. But in Grandma's kitchen, it was just cornmeal mush. It showed up at breakfast more often than not, especially during lean months. These days, it is almost never mentioned outside of old cookbooks or Appalachian food blogs. But it deserves a second look. Few dishes stretch so far, last so long, or feel quite so honest on a plate. Rice ring with creamed vegetables was the side you pulled out to impress, even if all you had was rice, peas, and a few carrots. This molded rice dish showed up at luncheons, community suppers, and potlucks from the 1930s to the 60s, proving how fancy rice could look with the right presentation. You cooked seasoned rice, packed it into a bundt or gelatin mold, and once it's set, filled the center with creamy peas, carrots, and maybe mushrooms or green beans if you had them. It was affordable, filling, and looked fancier than it really was. These molded sides were all the rage, straight from vintage cookbooks with curled edges and faded ink. Rice ring with creamed vegetables was a no-nonsense way to stretch pantry staples while making the table look proper. You hardly see it outside old recipe cards now, but back then, it was a thrifty, creative dish that added kitchen pride to any meal. Pimento cheese on saltines was a southern staple that turned a few pantry ingredients into a quick, satisfying snack when groceries were running thin. You mixed up pimento cheese, usually some shredded cheddar, mayonnaise, chopped pimentos, and spread it over saltine crackers. That was it. 10 minutes or less, and you had something creamy, salty, and packed with flavor to hold you over until dinner. It might sound simple now, but back then, this little recipe kept homes running when budgets were stretched and time was short. The saltines gave it crunch, the pimento cheese added richness, and together they made a snack that showed up at school lunches, church picnics, or as a quick fix on busy afternoons. You would find this recipe scribbled onto old note cards, tucked in faded cookbooks, or passed down through generations of families who knew how to make the most of what they had. It might be forgotten today, but for plenty of folks back then, pimento cheese on saltines was a fast, filling favorite that saved the day more than once. Applesauce toast with nutmeg was the frugal breakfast tucked inside every homemaker column and Depression-era guide when groceries ran low but mornings kept coming. You would toast a slice of bread, smear it with applesauce, sprinkle a little nutmeg on top, and breakfast was done in under 10 minutes. It was practical, filling, and sweet enough to feel comforting when everything else felt stretched thin. Families leaned on meals like this when fruit was scarce, budgets were tight, and creativity had to carry the kitchen. Applesauce lasted longer than fresh fruit, nutmeg added warmth, and toast turned it all into a quick meal that actually filled you up. It was not fancy, but it worked, and you could find it everywhere from farm kitchens to city apartments. Some folks added butter, others kept it plain, but either way, it was one of those quiet little breakfasts that made hard mornings feel a little easier. These days, applesauce toast barely gets a mention, but back then it quietly carried families through. All right, let's talk about something a little more dignified: venison. Now, we're not talking about Bambi here, people. We're talking about grown-up deer meat. In hunting communities, barbecued venison was once a prized delicacy. Imagine the satisfaction of bagging a deer, bringing it home, and then turning it into a smoky masterpiece. It was not just a meal. Barbecued venison offered an experience. Venison's unique taste made it a standout choice for barbecue lovers looking to break away from the usual fare. It was typically marinated in a mixture of spices and herbs to complement its natural flavor. The best part? It is lean and packed with protein. Fitness freaks would have loved it if it was on the menu still. Calls for a comeback, don't you think? Corn oysters were one of those Depression-era dishes that did not have a lick of seafood but still felt like something fancy. Grandma would mix corn, usually fresh or canned, with eggs, flour, and a bit of milk to make a thick batter. Then she would fry little spoonfuls in hot oil or bacon grease until they puffed up golden and crispy around the edges. The name came from the way they looked, round, plump, and golden, like a fried oyster. But they were made of nothing more than corn and love. These fritters were often served as a side dish with soup or meatloaf, or even stacked up for breakfast. They were quick to make, easy to stretch, and always got eaten before they had time to cool. Kids loved them, adults counted on them, and they used up whatever corn you had on hand. Some folks added chopped peppers or onions for extra flavor, but the original was good enough all by itself. Corn oysters were proof that you did not need much to make something satisfying. You just needed a hot pan, a good spoon, and a little bit of memory. 3 bean-molded salad was one of those curious creations from vintage cookbooks that made vegetables and gelatin collide in the strangest way. You would take the classic 3-bean salad, green beans, wax beans, kidney beans, and suspend the whole thing in lemon or lime-flavored gelatin, set it in a mold, and proudly serve it at potlucks or family dinners. Back in the 1950s and 60s, molded salads were a rite of passage in every community cookbook, and this one was no different. It looked fancy, stretched pantry staples, and made sure not a single bean went to waste. People loved it for the bright colors, wobbly texture, and how it sat proudly next to roast meats or casseroles. It might sound a little off-putting now, but back then, molded salads were considered practical and even impressive. This one in particular packed protein, vegetables, and a little retro flair all in one strange, shimmering dish. You might not see it outside of vintage recipe cards today, but once upon a time, it was the talk of every potluck. Tomato soup with cracker crumble was the ultimate quick fix when groceries were low and appetites were high. You heated up a can of tomato soup, crushed some saltines over the top, and called it a meal. It sounds basic, but it hit the spot. Grandma's cookbook was full of these quick, practical recipes that stretched every last pantry staple, and this one was no exception. The saltines soaked up the soup, adding just enough crunch and thickness to make it filling. Parents loved it because it cost next to nothing and came together in 10 minutes flat. Kids loved it because it was warm, salty, and familiar. You could always dress it up with a sprinkle of cheese or some pepper, but most families kept it plain and simple. It was the kind of meal you would find after school, in chilly weather, or on those nights when there just was not time for anything else. Fast, affordable, and quietly forgotten, like so many of the recipes tucked into the back pages of Grandma's old cookbook. Cottage cheese with canned fruit cocktail was the speedy, no-cook breakfast that lived in every 1970s diet book and homemaker guide, promising light meals that took barely any effort. You would scoop cottage cheese onto a plate, pour canned fruit cocktail over the top, and breakfast was done in under 10 minutes. Sweet, creamy, and surprisingly filling, it worked when mornings were busy, but everyone still needed something practical to eat. Families leaned on meals like this when groceries were tight, and dieters swore by it for being low effort and satisfying enough to skip the fancy recipes. It was a trick you could find tucked inside women's magazines, diet plans, and community cookbooks trying to stretch fruit and dairy into a real meal. Some folks added nuts or honey, others kept it plain. But either way, it quietly filled countless tables before frozen meals and boxed breakfasts took over. Funny how those quick, reliable meals slipped away. Okay, now that we've covered the respectable mutton, let's move on to something a bit more, shall we say, adventurous. Smoked squirrel. In the early days of barbecue, this little critter made quite a splash at gatherings. If you think about it, the squirrel is kind of like nature's version of a barbecue snack, small, tasty, and with just the right amount of seasoning. The smoked squirrel was typically prepared by slow smoking the meat until it was infused with a rich, smoky flavor. It was a favorite among pioneers and early settlers who needed to make the most of their resources. While it might sound a bit unusual today, it's a great example of how barbecue traditions evolve based on what's available and what people enjoy. These days, you might not see a smoked squirrel on your local barbecue menu, but it's definitely a dish that deserves a place in barbecue history. Peas and pearl onions were a staple of wintertime cooking, especially when fresh vegetables were hard to come by. Grandma knew how to make something special out of pantry basics, and this dish was proof. Canned or frozen peas were gently warmed with tender pearl onions, often from a jar, and simmered in butter or a light cream sauce. The result was simple but comforting, with just enough sweetness and bite to sit perfectly alongside roast turkey or baked ham. You would see it on holiday tables, often scooped out of a deep ceramic dish with a worn wooden spoon. Some families added herbs like thyme or parsley, but the heart of the recipe never changed. It was about taking small, soft vegetables and giving them care, warmth, and just a bit of love. Peas and pearl onions did not shout for attention. They were the quiet kind of dish that stuck with you anyway. They are almost never made anymore, except by the rare home cook flipping through a dusty cookbook. But for the folks who remember, one bite can bring back a dozen meals from long ago. Macaroni and tomatoes was the forgotten side that kept dinner plates full when grocery budgets were stretched thin. You would boil macaroni, toss it with stewed tomatoes, a pat of butter, and maybe onions or cheese if you had extra. It was not glamorous, but it got the job done. You could find this simple pasta side in old community cookbooks from the 40s through the 70s, tucked between casserole recipes and Jell-O molds. Families loved it because it used pantry staples, cost little, and made meals stretch farther. It showed up next to pork chops, meatloaf, or whatever leftovers you had. Macaroni and tomatoes was the quiet hero of the table, filling bellies when money was tight. You do not see it much now, but in its day, it was a practical filling side that showed how far folks could go with a box of pasta and a can of tomatoes. Peanut butter and marshmallow sandwiches were one of those simple little joys that made their way into school lunches, church picnics, and kitchen tables across America. It did not take much. Just some soft sandwich bread, a good swipe of creamy peanut butter, and a generous helping of marshmallow fluff right out of the jar. The whole thing came together in under 10 minutes, but it stuck with you longer than that. It was sweet, sticky, and packed with that gooey marshmallow center that kids could not get enough of. Adults loved how fast and affordable it was, especially when grocery budgets were tight. You would spot this recipe scribbled on note cards, tucked into church cookbooks, or passed down by word of mouth from one busy home cook to another. It was a sugar rush, sure, but it was also a reminder of the quick comfort food that helped families stretch what they had. Funny how something that fast and that fun could quietly disappear from kitchen tables over time. Buttered cornflake toast was one of those forgotten 10-minute breakfasts that once lived in every kid's cookbook or church bulletin. You would toast a slice of soft white bread, slather it with butter or peanut butter if you had it, then smash some cornflakes on top. That was it. Crunchy, sweet, filling, and ready before the school bus pulled up. It was not some gourmet recipe, just a quick fix that felt special on rushed mornings. Most families kept cereal on hand anyway, and this was a way to stretch it when the grocery budget was tight. Sometimes parents sprinkled sugar on top, other times it was plain, but either way it turned leftover cereal into breakfast that actually stuck with you. You could even swap peanut butter for jam or just plain butter, depending on what was left in the fridge. These kinds of quick breakfasts were everywhere in old cookbooks. Simple, made from pantry staples, and good enough to get everyone out the door without complaints. All right, let's talk about a barbecue ingredient that's more often found in the pot than on the plate: smoked turkey necks. Now, these aren't exactly barbecue stars, but they do deserve a mention. Smoked turkey necks were once a popular ingredient in soups and stews, adding a rich, smoky depth to dishes that made them savory. The process of smoking turkey necks involved slow cooking them over a wood fire, which infused the meat with a smoky flavor while keeping it tender and juicy. Although they might not be the star of modern barbecue menus, smoked turkey necks still hold a special place in the hearts of those who appreciate their unique flavor and versatility. Copper pennies were more than just a colorful dish. They were a reminder that simple vegetables could still feel dressed up when times were tight. These were sliced carrots marinated in a tangy sweet sauce made from vinegar, sugar, and sometimes just a dash of dry mustard. The recipe usually came from a stained card in Grandma's tin box, the kind she would pull out for church potlucks or Sunday suppers. You could serve them cold or slightly warm, and the flavor only got better after a night in the icebox. The bright orange color stood out on even the most modest dinner table, and they were easy to make in bulk with very little fuss. Canned carrots worked just fine if you had no fresh ones, which helped stretch this into leaner seasons. And while the name might sound silly now, anyone who grew up with them remembers how good they looked lined up beside the ham or roast. Some people even thought it was the one way they liked carrots. But somewhere along the way, this cheerful little side dish faded into memory, tucked between pages of cookbooks that no one opens anymore. Corn pudding casserole was the side dish that made even the humblest dinner plate feel warm and complete. If you flipped through old recipe cards tucked behind flour jars, chances are this one was written in your grandmother's handwriting. It combined sweet corn, butter, eggs, and milk into a creamy bake that sat proudly next to roast ham or pork chops. It was easy, affordable, and filled bellies, making it a go-to for potlucks, church suppers, and holidays. The top baked up golden brown, the inside stayed soft and rich, and every bite reminded you how folks pulled meals together from what they had. Corn pudding casserole carried meals through tough times, earning its place in kitchens from the Depression to the 70s. You do not see it much now, but back then, that creamy baked corn meant comfort on a plate. Egg salad on toast was one of those practical 10-minute meals that filled lunch boxes, fed tired workers, and showed up in every community cookbook for good reason. Leftover boiled eggs were never wasted. You chopped them up, mixed them with mayonnaise, maybe a little mustard if you were lucky, and piled it all onto a slice of toast. It sounds plain, but it got the job done. The eggs were filling, the toast made it portable, and you could whip it up in no time flat. This was not about fancy ingredients or gourmet flavors. It was the kind of recipe people leaned on when money was tight, time was short, and families still had to eat. You would see it at church luncheons, quick weekday dinners, or scribbled down on worn recipe cards tucked into kitchen drawers. It might be forgotten now, but egg salad on toast kept plenty of households going when they needed it most. Egg salad on white bread, open-faced, was the speedy breakfast that showed up in every 1960s lunchroom and kitchen guide when mornings were short but something filling still needed to hit the table. You would mash pre-boiled eggs with mayo, salt, and pepper, spread it on white bread, and serve it open-faced. That was breakfast, ready in under 10 minutes, practical, affordable, and good enough to carry you through the day. Families leaned on meals like this when groceries were limited, but eggs stretched far and filled hungry bellies. It was not fancy, but it was reliable, tucked into community cookbooks and school lunch guides that promised quick, no-fuss meals. Some folks added pickles or herbs, others kept it plain, but either way, it turned leftover eggs into something that worked fast. These days, it is rare to see egg salad show up outside of potlucks or picnics, but back then, it was a small, simple breakfast that actually stuck with you. Let's move to barbecued pork blood sausage, also known as morsilla, which is a dish that's as unique as it is flavorful. Now, this isn't your average sausage. Traditionally, pork blood sausage was made with pig's blood mixed with rice, spices, and other ingredients. The mixture is then stuffed into a casing and cooked. Barbecuing adds a smoky depth to the already complex flavors. This delicacy is particularly popular in regions like Spain, Portugal, and the Philippines. In these countries, blood sausage is a beloved ingredient in many traditional dishes. While it might not be for everyone, blood sausage offers a rewarding experience for adventurous eaters. Its rich history and unique taste make it a fascinating dish to try. Rice-stuffed bell peppers were a dish that turned summer garden bounty into something worth remembering. Grandma would take big, shiny peppers, green or red depending on what grew best, and hollow them out with care. Then came the filling: cooked rice mixed with cheese, vegetables, tomato sauce, and sometimes ground beef or beans. She would bake them until the peppers softened and the tops browned just slightly. The dish smelled like comfort itself, bubbling quietly in a worn-out casserole pan. These stuffed peppers were served warm, but tasted just as good the next day out of the icebox. They were frugal, filling, and full of flavor, ideal for feeding a crowd with just a few ingredients. For many families, they were a way to use up leftovers and still put something beautiful on the table. The colors alone made them feel like a celebration. They are still made here and there, but often buried under cheese or too fussy to feel the same. The original ones were about balance, vegetables doing the heavy lifting, rice carrying the weight. They were summer in edible form, baked in love. Tomato aspic with celery and olives was one of those curious gelatin-based sides that ruled vintage cookbooks but slipped quietly off dinner tables as times changed. You would take savory tomato juice or seasoned broth, mix it with gelatin, and suspend chopped celery, olives, and sometimes hard-boiled eggs inside, then chill it in a mold until firm. It sounds strange now, but back in the 1950s and 60s, molded salads were a symbol of pride and resourcefulness, showing up at luncheons, holiday dinners, and potlucks all across America. Tomato aspic was considered elegant, even a little fancy, turning pantry staples into a glossy, structured side that balanced out roast meats, fried chicken, or whatever leftovers you had. Families leaned on recipes like this to stretch groceries and bring something unique to the table without spending a fortune. It looked impressive, it used affordable ingredients, and it made even the simplest meal feel dressed up. You might not see tomato aspic much today outside of retro cookbooks or quirky food blogs, but back then, it was proof that creativity and practicality ruled the kitchen, no matter how odd the presentation looked. Cornflake-crusted fried bologna was one of those quick, crispy fixes that turned a plain slice of bologna into a satisfying meal in no time flat. You dredged a slice of bologna in crushed cornflakes, tossed it in a hot skillet, and fried it until the edges curled and the coating crisped up. That was it. No fancy ingredients, no complicated steps, just a fast, crunchy meal made from pantry staples. It might sound odd now, but back when budgets were tight and groceries had to stretch, this was a clever way to turn everyday bologna into something that felt a little more special. The cornflakes added crunch. The bologna sizzled up with salty flavor, and the whole thing came together in under 10 minutes. You would find this recipe scribbled into old cookbooks, passed around busy households, or whispered between neighbors looking for quick, affordable meal ideas. It might seem forgotten today, but for plenty of families back then, cornflake-crusted fried bologna was a fast, filling fix when time and money were both running short. Okay, we're back to pork, but in a whole new way. Pork cracklins. These delicious morsels were made by frying the skin and fat of the pig until they were golden brown and crispy. In America, cracklins were often enjoyed as a snack or served as a topping for various dishes. Now, these haven't completely fallen off the radar, so if you still want to try them, I guess it's time to book a flight. In the Philippines, pork cracklins are known as chicharron, and they're a popular snack and ingredient in many traditional dishes. Chicharron is often enjoyed with a tangy vinegar dipping sauce or used to add crunch and flavor to stews and soups. Succotash with lima beans was not just a dish, it was a Depression-era survival tool that somehow made it into Grandma's regular rotation. Sweet corn and soft lima beans were simmered together in a little butter or cream, sometimes with bell peppers or onions tossed in for good measure. It was filling, cheap, and surprisingly nutritious, which made it perfect for families trying to stretch every last dime. Succotash had deep roots too, traced back to Native American cooking, and became especially popular in the South and Midwest. If your grandma had a victory garden, you probably had succotash at least once a week. It was served warm, spooned right from the pot, and though it was never flashy, it was honest food. A dish that said, "We have enough to share." Some people added bacon or ham to punch it up, others kept it plain and let the vegetables speak. But the core recipe stayed the same for generations. These days, succotash barely makes an appearance outside of history books or heritage festivals. Succotash with lima beans was not just a dish, it was a Depression-era survival tool that somehow made it into Grandma's regular rotation. Sweet corn and soft lima beans were simmered together in a little butter or cream, sometimes with bell peppers or onions tossed in for good measure. It was filling, cheap, and surprisingly nutritious, which made it perfect for families trying to stretch every last dime. Succotash had deep roots too, traced back to Native American cooking, and became especially popular in the South and Midwest. If your grandma had a victory garden, you probably had succotash at least once a week. It was served warm, spooned right from the pot, and though it was never flashy, it was honest food. A dish that said, "We have enough to share." Some people added bacon or ham to punch it up, others kept it plain and let the vegetables speak. But the core recipe stayed the same for generations. These days, succotash barely makes an appearance outside of history books or heritage festivals. Peanut butter and sweet pickle sandwiches were one of those strange combinations that somehow became a regular part of vintage kitchen routines. You spread creamy peanut butter on soft sandwich bread, added sliced sweet pickles, and pressed it together. That was it. Quick, crunchy, and a little tangy with just enough sweetness to balance it out. It sounds odd now, but back then, it was a favorite for busy lunches, quick after-school snacks, or when there was not much else in the pantry. The peanut butter gave it richness, the pickles added bite, and together they made a sandwich that stuck to your ribs and kept you going. You would find this one scribbled in old recipe boxes passed around at church picnics or quietly tucked into Grandma's cookbook among the other quirky 10-minute meals. Families leaned on this recipe because it came together fast, filled you up, and used ingredients most people always had on hand. It might be forgotten now, but for plenty of households back then, peanut butter and sweet pickle sandwiches were a surprising lifesaver when time and money were both running short. Now, squirrels aren't the only bushy-tailed animals on the list, because barbecued rabbits were the talk of the town in the early 20th century. In rural areas where game meat was more common than store-bought cuts, rabbit was a go-to option. Think of it as a tender, flavorful rabbit marinated in a tangy sauce and then grilled to perfection. It's like the barbecue equivalent of a Sunday roast but with a bit more pizzazz. The barbecued rabbit was often seasoned with a blend of herbs and spices that set it apart from other barbecue options available. Rabbit barbecue wasn't as exotic as a squirrel, but it was still pretty uncommon. It was a staple in many rural barbecues. People would gather around the pit, sharing stories and swapping rabbit recipes. But as times changed, so did tastes. It's a shame, really. I mean, low fat, high protein, and finger-licking delicious. What's not to love? German potato salad was never meant to be cold, and that was the beauty of it. Grandma would boil red potatoes until tender, then toss them with crisp bacon, diced onions, and a sharp vinegary dressing while everything was still warm. The result was tangy, salty, and just a little sweet, rich from the bacon but lifted by the vinegar. It was a staple at summer picnics and church potlucks, served straight from the pan or kept warm under foil. Unlike the creamy versions most people know today, this one had no mayonnaise and needed no chilling. It felt more like a real dish than a filler side, and it paired perfectly with sausages, roast chicken, or just a good slice of rye bread. You might find a recipe scribbled in pencil in the back of Grandma's cookbook, passed down from a German aunt or neighbor. It was hearty, practical, and impossible to stop eating once you started. These days, it is rare to find someone who still makes it from scratch. But the warmth, both literal and emotional, is something no cold potato salad can match. Which 70s side dish would you dare to bring back? Comment, like, and subscribe for more tasty blasts from the past.